church was the very first day I attended that this church can sing. And it struck me again this morning, so it was fantastic just to listen. Well done. And I'm sure it's, God will be thankful for our praise through our singing, so thank you. Now, can you hear me up the back? That's better, isn't it? Now, this morning's message is focused on the book of Judges, but begins in Joshua. So here's just a very quick summary of what happens, starting from the end of Joshua through into Judges. Joshua chapter 24, verses 15 issues this challenge to the Israelites. But if serving the Lord seems undesirable to you, then choose for yourselves this day whom you will serve, whether the gods your ancestors served beyond the Euphrates, or the gods of the Amorites, in whose land you are living. And the response is crystal clear. I'll just move the slides forward. That's the first one. And the response is, and the people said to Joshua, we will serve the Lord our God and obey him. And they did. Joshua chapter 2, verses 6 and 7. Judges chapter 2, verses 6 and 7. After Joshua had dismissed the Israelites, they went to take possession of the land, each to their own inheritance. The people served the Lord throughout the lifetime of Joshua and of the elders who outlived him and who had seen all the great things the Lord had done for Israel. And they were blessed by God. Then, however, Judges chapter 2, verses 10 and 11. After that whole generation had been gathered to their ancestors, another generation grew up who neither knew the Lord nor what he had done for Israel. Then the Israelites did evil in the eyes of the Lord and served the Baals. And the consequences of this, we read this in Judges chapter 2, verses 12 to 14. They forsook the Lord. They followed and worshipped various gods of the peoples around them. They aroused the Lord's anger because they forsook him and served the Baals and the Ashtoreths. In his anger against Israel, the Lord gave them into the hands of raiders who plundered them. He sold them into the hands of their enemies all around, whom they were no longer able to resist. And that's the story of Judges, repeated over a period of 350 years or so. The book of Judges also repeats this phrase or something very similar 8 times over this 350-year period. Again, the Israelites did evil in the eyes of the Lord, forsaking the Lord, suffering, repenting, being rescued by God through the judges raised up by God, living in peace, and then the whole cycle of disobedience and repentance is repeated again and again and again. So there we have it. Perhaps we can all go home now. I've told you what's happened. But the reasons behind this cycle of obedience and disobedience are still with us today. And now just one question. If you've ever ridden a bicycle, can you please just raise your hand? So I'm serious, just raise your hand. Well, that's a pretty fair percentage, isn't it? That's good. Now, what happens when you stop pedalling your bicycle? Depending upon how fast you're going, the bicycle will sooner or later come to a stop. And unless you're very good at balancing, you need to put at least one foot on the ground to stop from falling off. And what you need to do in riding a bike is an analogy for the actions of the Israelites in the book of Judges. When they obeyed God, they made progress in possessing the promised land, and they prospered and lived in peace. Using the bicycle analogy, they were pedaling with God. When they disobeyed God They suffered and were defeated and oppressed by the nations they were meant to dispossess from the land, and God abandoned them. And going back to the bicycle analogy, they'd stopped pedaling with God and they fell off. This cycle of obedience and disobedience happened time and time again, and each time as this cycle went on, the obedience to God and their faith became weaker, and their ensuing disaster grew worse than the previous disaster, and eventually leading to civil war and anarchy. Now there's three aspects of this tragedy of peddling with God and not peddling with God to look at. The first one, I'm just going to make some explanations of some of the words and terms used. Then I'm going to go into a little bit more detail about the Judges story. And finally, what does Judges mean for our faith today? So the explanations. Just 4 brief explanations to clarify a few aspects from the reading. The word judge had a wider meaning for the Israelites of that time and place than what it does for us now. It meant not only presiding over legal matters as we understand it, but also included authority over administrative issues and military issues. The judges were leaders but subservient to God. Israel then was a theocracy. In other words, God was their ruler. Many nations that the Israelites came up again in point 2, many nations that the Israelites came up against in their occupation of a promised land are mentioned. And you'll see up there, I hope you can read it, this table on the screen behind me shows the relationship of many of these nations going right back to Noah and Adam, including the Canaanites. Down the bottom right-hand corner, you can see 12 sons and Israelites leading back up through Jacob to Isaac and Abraham, and right back to Noah, Seth and Adam. But you'll also see a lot of the tribes mentioned, or nations mentioned, in the books of Joshua and Judges. You'll see the Midianites, the Ammonites, the Moabites, the Amalekites and the Canaanites, etc. And the references you see in there, like for example to 6, 9 to 10 and 10, 1 to 32, are the chapters and verses in the book of Genesis. So the table shows the historical relationship between the Israelites and these other nations who are living in Canaan. Now, in the rest of this message, I'll mainly use the words Canaanite or Canaanites as a generic word to describe the inhabitants of Canaan, or the promised land that the Israelites came across. And just as an aside, this table or slide is an extract from a book called The Divine Drama, the Biblical Narrative, and it's by Crossways International. And just as a second aside, if you're interested, there's one copy in the op shop, and it's for sale for $5. I've now finished the ad. Now we come across the third point, is the name Baal or Baals and Ashtarif or Astarte or Asherah. And these are all mentioned in the reading in Judges 2 verses 11 and 13 and elsewhere. Baal was worshipped as the chief god of the nations in and around the promised land. And it was also believed that his wife was a goddess Ashtarif or Astarte. Baal worship was a fertility-based worship whose core belief was that when the rain fell to earth, it was a sign of a god Baal and the goddess Ashtoreth indulging in procreation. And notes in my NIV Bible state that lascivious worship practices were indulged. And this was a belief that the gods could be persuaded to have intimate relations by their believers doing the same during temple worship. And another odious feature of Baal worship was child sacrifice. And the Israelites were specifically warned by God not to be influenced by Baal worship. And when you read through Judges, there are several references to Ashtarif Poles, which were sacred trees or poles standing near Canaanite religious locations to honour the goddess Ashtarif. And in Judges chapter 6, verse 25, God instructs the judge Gideon to tear down your father's altar to Baal and cut down the Asherah pole beside it. Then build a proper kind of altar to the Lord your God on top of this height, using the wood of the Asherah pole that you cut down. And 1,000 or so years later, we read in Paul that Ashtoreth was also known as Aphrodite to the Greeks and Venus to the Romans. And Corinth, as pointed out in Paul's letter to the Corinthians, was a centre of worship to Aphrodite. And Paul referred to the influence of such worship on the early Christian believers in his letters to the Corinthians. So it wasn't just something that was happening at the time of Joshua and the Judges, it kept on happening. Now let's look at the story of the book of Judges in more detail. Remembering what God had done for the Israelites, not only going back to Abraham, but in leading them in the conquest of a promised land, it's difficult to understand from a distance of some 3,300 years how the Israelites could walk away from God. The Israelites were reminded themselves by Joshua of what wonderful things God had done for them, but they still walked away. And Joshua reminded them, the Israelites, that God had long ago led Abraham and his family from what is present-day Iraq into Canaan and promised it to his descendants. God had provided Abraham with many descendants, including Isaac. And God had moved Isaac's son Jacob and his family to Egypt. And God had, through Moses and Aaron, rescued the Israelites from Egypt, including leading them on dry land across the Red Sea, but drowning the pursuing Egyptians. And God had provided them during 40 years in the wilderness. And God had allowed them to defeat the Amorites east of the River Jordan, and they had occupied that land. And God had rescued them from the Moabites and had blessed them through the pagan personality of Balaam. Then, of course, as we heard in this morning's reading, the Israelites crossed the Jordan, where I might add that God stopped the flow of the Jordan and they crossed on dry land. Then, through God's power, they conquered large portions of Canaan. But despite all that God had done for them, they still persisted in disobeying him. Until, of course, they had to endure so much hardship that they turned back to God. And what happened then? They turned back to God. And what happened then? Judges chapter 2, verses 16 to 19 tells us, "Then the Lord raised up judges who saved them out of the hands of these raiders. Yet they would not listen to their judges, but prostituted themselves to other gods and worshipped them. They quickly turned away from the ways of their ancestors who had been obedient to the Lord's commands. Whenever the Lord raised up a judge for them, he was with the judge and saved them out of the hands of their enemies as long as the judge lived. For the Lord relented because of their groaning under those who oppressed and afflicted them. But when the judge died, the people returned to ways even more corrupt than those of their ancestors, following other gods and serving and worshipping them. They refused to give up their evil practices and stubborn ways." Now here's one reason I believe why this seemed to happen repeatedly. Judges chapter 1, verses 27 and 29. "But Manasseh did not drive out the people of Bethshan or Tanakh and their surrounding settlements, for the Canaanites were determined to live in that land. When Israel became strong, They pressed the Canaanites into forced labour, but never drove them out completely. Nor did Ephraim drive out the Canaanites living in Gaza, but the Canaanites continued to live there among them. And in Joshua chapter 15, verse 63, Judah could not dislodge the Jebusites who were living in Jerusalem to this day. The Jebusites lived there with the people of Judah. Manasseh, Ephraim and Judah are of course Israelite tribes, and similar was said about the other Israelite tribes. Their failure to fully occupy the land was a consequence of walking away from God. And this failure by the Israelites to fully occupy the land led to them living in close proximity to the Canaanites, which in turn led to intermarriage, the adoption of Canaanite religious and cultural beliefs, and the Israelites began to worship Baal and adopt their lifestyles. And to some extent, I can explain this to myself by comparing lifestyles. The Israelites had been nomadic for 40 years and made their living from herds of goats, sheep and cattle, whereas the tribes of the Promised Land were more farmers and traders, living in one location and cultivating the land. The Israelites now had to adapt to becoming farmers and not nomads, and would have looked to and sought to learn from the Canaanites. It's just a pity they did not look to God instead. And the thought processes probably went something like this. The land was flowing with milk and honey. The Canaanites worshipped Baal. So Baal must be blessing the Canaanites. So why don't we, that is the Israelites, adopt Baal worship as well? With intermarriage between the groups and the proximity between the groups, the cultural and religious influences from the Canaanites were there in daily life. So the Israelites began to adopt the Canaanites' religious and cultural beliefs. I think another human trait was at work as well. In Joshua chapter 24, verse 13, we read, "So I gave you a land on which you did not toil, and cities you did not build, and you live in them and eat from vineyards and olive groves that you did not plant." And being led by God, the Israelites had endured much over the more than 40 years since leaving Egypt. And then being still led by God, a large portion of Canaan had been conquered. Living now with the obvious possibility of a much more comfortable life in cities and enjoying their gift from God, built on the toil of others, maybe they thought it was time to put away the more arduous responsibilities expected of them by God and begin to enjoy a more comfortable lifestyle. Following God's laws was simply too hard, whereas following Baal and the Canaanite lifestyle was easier. And just a personal example of this that I've seen happen in my own working life. Now I worked in the building industry for over 50 years and had first the experience of one large building company that had been operating very successfully for over 50 years. And then the founders of that company retired and the younger family members took over. But unfortunately, they had become used to a more comfortable lifestyle and were not prepared to put in the hard work of the founders. The younger members became sloppy and eventually they went broke. I mean, fancy turning up at a meeting to cry that you're down to your last dollar in your Rolls-Royce Silver Shadow. They'd just stopped pedalling that bicycle of hard work. And maybe in a similar vein, this "it's all too hard" attitude was one of the reasons for the Israelites turning away from God. So what do we have? Disobedience to God by not following his covenant, including failing to dispossess the Canaanites of the land, mingling with the Canaanites, intermarriage with the Canaanites, Baal worship, adopting the Canaanite culture and lifestyle, and forsaking God. So God deserted them as he told them he would, and they suffered under Canaanite rule. The Israelites then cried out to God, who raised up judges to rescue them. And so, briefly, who were the judges? In order, they were Othniel, a judge who still had the belief in God of Joshua's generation. Ehud, also described as a good judge. And Shamgar, who was possibly a Canaanite, but used by God to deliver the Israelites from the Philistines. Then we had Deborah, together with Barak. And Deborah follows God unquestioningly. Barak is doubtful, but will follow Deborah. And Deborah, you can say, is a good judge. Then Gideon, who initially doubted God, but came to trust him, and led Israel through God to victory over the Midianites. However, he then murders several Israelites out of revenge and builds a gold idol that the Israelites worship after Gideon dies. And then you see that the whole cycle is beginning again. Gideon, a good judge, and then maybe not so good a judge. Of the next 6 judges, little is known, but they were raised up by God to rescue the Israelites from their self-imposed oppression. And these were Toiah and Jair, Jephthah, Ibzan, Elon, and Abdon. And then we come to the last judge, who was Samson. And Samson can be described as a womanizer, impulsive, arrogant, and violent, and a man who often abandoned God. However, he responded through faith to God when needed by God to again rescue the Israelites from the results of their own disobedience. And Samson, although he had faith which came through when it was necessary, was probably the worst judge the Israelites had. But these judges were just people, and some were nasty characters, and even the good ones had moments of spiritual weakness. But acting on God's urging through the Spirit of God, they were given the authority by God to lead. They trusted and obeyed God when it mattered, and that in its simplest form is faith. Just 2 final comments on Judges. And the very last verse in Judges, chapter 21, verse 25 reads, In those days, Israel had no king. Everyone did as they saw fit. You can call that anarchy. And what is also obvious in Judges is the repeated response from God to cries from the Israelites to deliver them from their own folly. And he did. Given all this, maybe the Israelites of that time weren't all that different from many people today. So what message does Judges have for our faith today? Many people today who say they are Christians think that God is real, but keep him at arm's length. Maybe attending at Christmas and Easter and the occasional Sunday is about as far as they're prepared to go. Many others don't even go this far. They don't think much about God at all, if ever. They just do as they see fit. Other gods are worshipped instead. They may not be recognised formally as gods, but they're certainly idolised and worshipped. And I think you know what I'm going to say. It's the idols of money and power and sex and sport, the arts, success, fame, and the cult of self, just to name a few. And paraphrasing what Joshua told the Israelites after the conquest of much of a promised land, we have a choice. But if serving the Lord seems undesirable to you, then choose for yourselves this day whom you will serve, whether the Baals of the past or the idols of contemporary Western culture in whose land you are living. The choice is for all of us as to whom we will serve. Whether, like the Israelites in the time of the Judges, we choose to serve the Baals of contemporary Western culture, or instead, do we choose to serve God? There's a balance to strike, and that balance needs to be in favour of God and acceptable to God. Many of our current fashionable idols are totally unacceptable to God. and others can be enjoyed, but not to the point of denying God. God should be ruling our lives and not just slotted in where we think we've got the time. When we do allow God to rule our lives, it may not be a total bed of roses, but through faith in Jesus Christ, we will experience peace and we will experience that special relationship with God. But if we stop pedaling that analogous bike with God, we're just going to fall off and seriously hurt ourselves when we find ourselves hurtling down that hill at an uncontrollable speed. Then we won't be going anywhere. But when we keep pedaling that bike with God, with God, through the presence of the Holy Spirit, we'll be making progress, travelling in the right direction, and experiencing the benefits of a better life now and forever. Let's praise God. Yeah.